John Middleton Murry, The Critic as Moralist, by Sharron, Greer, Cassavant. Introduction: A Brief History of a Critic. John Middleton Murry published his first book, Dostoevsky, in 1916, his last, Love, Freedom and Society, in 1956. Known primarily as a literary critic and editor, and even more widely as the husband of Kathrine Mansfield and the friend of D.H. Lawrence, Murray also thought and wrote about broader cultural issues. He was a failed creative writer, a spokesman for causes, and a founder of many enterprises, including a communal farm which provided a haven for pacifists during the Second World War. An astonishingly prolific writer, he produced almost 50 books and innumerable pamphlets, essays, and reviews in the course of a complicated, energetic life. Murray's reputation as a man of letters rose and fell dramatically. In the years surrounding the First World War, he was the young man on the rise, the bright, particular star of English criticism. Before the war, he founded the little magazine Rhythm, later the Blue Review, which attracted the attention of the avant-garde and introduced him to the literary establishment. With D.H. Lawrence, Murray contributed to Signature, the short-lived journal published during the war to vent Lawrence's spleen about war and power politics. Murray's great opportunity came in 1919, when at age 30 he became editor of the Athenaeum. Under his leadership, the moribund journal gained an ephemeral international brilliance. The talents he drew upon were the writers who created the literary history of the 20s, many of whom gained their first forum in the Athenaeum. His approach was intensely serious. Too serious, some said, for his high intellectualism lacked broad appeal, and the journal suffered financially, merging with The Nation in February 1921. Soon after, Murray was invited to give the Raleigh Lectures at Oxford. Published as The Problem of Style, these essays solidified Murray's position as a serious, original critic who could attack old problems freshly. He was subsequently offered a post at Oxford, but declined, as he did throughout his life, the invitation to an academic career. His energies were too diffuse and variable to be channeled principally into scholarship, and unlike F.R. Leavis, he didn't see how to make a challenge of it. For Murray, academia represented too easy a choice. The 2 years with the Athenaeum were the peak of his reputation. He moved in the circles of success, admired by Bloomsburyites and Sitwells, a guest at famous houses. Urged toward greater ambition by his wife, Kathrine Mansfield, Murray treated his sudden influence with naive arrogance, telling a bemused Ottoline Morel, the most celebrated literary hostess of the day, that he and Kathrine were beginning to be recognized as the most important literary authorities in England, adding, "If we believe in you, it shows that you are of value." In 1923, a few weeks after Kathrine Mansfield's death, Murray underwent a mystical experience which led him to make a holocaust of his former life and deliberately renounce his specialized role as literary journalist and critic. He emerged as a cultural critic with a mission. His new magazine, the Adelphi, offended most of the intelligentsia and D.H. Lawrence, for whom it was purportedly founded, but the journal acquired a broad public following, and Murray gained disciples. The broadly ambiguous credo, faith in life, gave him latitude for conversion to a variety of social, religious, and political doctrines, by which he made zigzag progress through the 1930s and 1940s. In 1936, Rainer Heppenstall called Murray the best-hated man of letters in England, and no one contradicted him. Bloomsbury dismissed Murray as soon as the earnest moral questing of the Adelphi revealed his reach for a wide, unliterary audience. "Can you imagine a man of education could sink so low?" Dora Carrington sneered after reading the first issue. Murray created controversy in other quarters by filling the early issues of the Adelphi with Kathrine's unpublished letters and journal, disregarding her written wish to destroy her papers. Her friends thought him disloyal and accused him of ghoulishly profiteering from his wife's death. Retrospectively, it is clear that Murray was almost solely responsible for the posthumous growth of her reputation, and no one now doubts that he served her and the world well by publishing the material. Indeed, since Kathrine's account of events was often critical of Murray, he served himself ill by releasing the papers. But he had cast Kathrine into the role of Keats, the young genius cut off before the peak of achievement, regarded the unpublished work as a revelation of her promise, and felt driven to give it to the world. The accusation that Murray was an opportunist rose again after D.H. Lawrence died. Murray's relations with Lawrence had been tempestuous and occasionally rivalrous since 1916. There had been misunderstandings on both sides, and in his last letter to Murray, Lawrence told him to give up hope of finding a meeting ground. But Murray found Lawrence so potent a force that he meditated on Lawrence's significance all his life, continuing that exploration even in his last book, Love, Freedom, and Society. However, Son of Woman, published the year after Lawrence died, aroused instant controversy by portraying Lawrence as a driven, Oedipal figure, obsessed by a sexual doctrine he could not express in his own being. Lawrence's friends regarded the book as a betrayal, and Murray became involved in endless justification. He sued Catherine Carswell for libeling him in her memoirs of Lawrence and forced the first edition of The Savage Pilgrim to be withdrawn, events which enhanced his notoriety and Lawrence's fame. Such controversies produced a one-dimensional public image of Murray, seen at its worst in Aldous Huxley's caricature of him as the hypocritical, childish, self-deceiving burlap of point-counterpoint. Meantime, Murray's approach to literary criticism had taken an unfashionable turn. Early in his career, he had led revolt against the genial laxness of Edwardian literary journalism, and The Problem of Style can easily be described as a precursor of the new criticism. By the mid-20s, he was standing against the tides of technical criticism. He defended the worth of the Romantic tradition and of critical intuition against T.S. Eliot's neoclassicism, insisting that too much intellectual formalization robs literature of its primary function, arousing a subjective response in the reader which leads to creative restructuring of life and values. More and more discontent with the literature of his own day, he turned to Shakespeare and the 19th century Romantics for art that could be taken seriously as a guide to conduct. To him, the great artist was a spiritual hero, a bearer of transcendent truth. Keats became and remained his touchstone. In the early 30s, Murray made the first of his political conversions. He gathered followers readily, but lost them with each turnabout, from socialism to Marxism, from Marxism to pacifism, so that former disciples became enemies or scoffers. Because he maintained a pacifist stance during World War II, Murray's general unpopularity grew. His books were scantily reviewed, and he was not offered the regular reviewing assignments which had been his principal livelihood. After World War II, Murray became for the first time a proponent of conservative political and economic values. The repudiation of extra-literary preoccupations, along with some of his iconoclastic values, freed him to explore the possibilities of professional literary criticism, which he had abjured since the 20s. His biography of Swift was widely and favorably reviewed. So too were the miscellaneous essays he produced in the last few years of his life. When he died in 1957, the old rancors had abated. He no longer threatened any important set of ideas, and the last reviewers added judicious praise to largely patronizing accounts of Murray's feuds and ideological oscillations. Within a few years, some critics began to lament the abuse he had suffered and issued more generous assessments of his achievements. However, the extent of Murray's contributions to 20th century letters has never been widely acknowledged. Many commentators have praised the early work and the late work, in which he deliberately strove for objectivity, but dismissed the subjectivity and confessionalism of the long middle period. Since Murray viewed criticism as a creative act in itself, he quite consciously breached ordinary decorum and taste. He often claimed a special access to intuitive truth, interlaced literary commentary with autobiographical revelation, and insisted that the critic must surrender himself to the artist, must become an enthusiast if he is to gain true insight. Understandably, many readers have set Murray aside before recognizing the astuteness of his judgments. Our access to Murray's thought is also impeded by the noticeable unevenness of his work. He wrote rapidly, easily, and with a remarkable absence of self-criticism. He made his living by writing, and once remarked that he couldn't afford the time to consider an idea unless he wrote about it. His most loyal admirers were frustrated by his resistance to rewriting. Richard Rees, his closest associate on the Adelphi, says that Murray refused to consider deleting weak passages on the grounds that the book's faults are part of the book. It may as well be seen as it is, warts and all. This vague justification is typically Murrayan in its implication that a book acquires an ontological status which renders its parts sacrosanct. To rewrite, he implies, would violate the purity and integrity of his thought, as though he had produced the words by automatic writing and believed that metaphysical truths would be violated by clarification. That attitude is fittingly punctured by Collis, fundamentally an admiring critic, who points out that no one wants our second best on paper. Style, like clarity, is often a kind of sincerity. It is certainly a mark of respect for the reader. Mr. Murray frequently prefers, in a frenzy of insincere sincerity, to spray a pot of ink in the public's face. These traits, as well as the often unfair and partial accounts of his relations with more famous and gifted contemporaries, have made Murray too often ridiculed and too little understood. All limitations considered, he produced a considerable body of illuminating criticism, and he made literature accessible to unsophisticated readers. He repeatedly placed himself in costing positions because he believed what he said, and, to an astonishing degree, allowed ideas to act upon him. The principles that underlay his judgments, that the great literary work must demonstrate a comprehensive moral vision which universalizes experience, that such works must be placed in a hierarchy according to the profundity of that vision, that art and life must not be held separate, are principles most great critics have held by. More than with most figures, the biographical facts shed light on the evolution of Murray's thought. He was the most personal of critics, and insisted that his life and his work must be seen as being of a piece. His personal life was unusually troubled. His first 2 wives died of tuberculosis, and his 3rd marriage was bitterly unhappy. He knew very little private peace until age 50, when he formed a fulfilling and pacific relationship with the woman who became his 4th wife. In a review of F.A. Lee's biography of Murray, Timms humorously pointed to the links between the shifts in Murray's career and his marriages. With Kathrine Mansfield, he was literary. With Violet Lemestre, also doomed to an early death from TB, metaphysical. With Betty Cockbain, a good cook but a poor scholar, socialist, and, under the stress of reconciling the irreconcilable, pacifist. With Mary Gamble, who provided him for the first time with the married bliss he craved, he was to become bucolic. This description, though amusingly apt, fails to acknowledge the counter-truth, that Murray's marriages, like other important life decisions, were shaped by his reactions to ideas. His disastrous marriage to Betty Cockbain was prompted by his conversion to Lawrence's doctrine of sexual fulfillment, in contrast to the idealistic spiritual love ideal which underlay his relations with Kathrine Mansfield and Violet Lemestre. He lived his beliefs, though often without fully understanding where they would take him. This study of the development of Murray's literary criticism attempts to trace the interaction of experience and idea which led Murray to take the paths he did. F.A. Lee's account of Murray's life, to which I am indebted for much biographical detail, deliberately emphasizes his role as a social thinker and largely neglects his literary criticism. While Griffin's study of the criticism, though often illuminating about particular works, excludes biographical data. My aim is to place Murray's critical work in its full context by describing how his personality, private values, and life experiences shaped his approaches to literature, and how his response to literature shaped his actions. Criticism, he said near the close of his career, as I wanted to practice it, depended on values, a determination of what is good for man. Certainly, the task of evaluating Murray's literary criticism is complicated by the entanglement of idea and personality, but that entanglement is the source of his vitality, the enlivening enthusiasm which more disinterested criticism too seldom attains.